Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ron Halber, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. The JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the Jewish community in our nation's capital, which is the third largest Jewish community in the United States. We represent more than 100 organizations and synagogues throughout the region. Our agency is a strong supporter of the state of Israel, and we work hard every day to advocate for a strong, safe, and democratic Israel. We support Israel's right to defend itself and its people against terrorism and any other security threat. I'd like to begin by thanking all of you who are joining us here today, and thank Adam Odesser, Director of our Dr. Stewart Israel Action Center, for arranging this webinar. As you know, it looks like we're getting closer to a potential deal with the United States, and its allies are getting closer to a potential deal with Iran, which obviously creates a need for discussion and a sense of angst, and among some American Jews, and a sense of favorability among some American Jews. On the other hand, there's also been in the last few days an unraveling. There's been some terrorist incidents that have led to the deaths before Tel Aviv of 11 Israelis, now up to maybe 13, 14 Israelis have been killed over a period of several weeks, which adds another level of complexity to the security situation. So when we began this webinar, we were going to focus only on Iran, but now it's impossible to avoid the other security challenges facing the state of Israel. And we will ask both of our wonderful panelists to join us here today to comment on those. And with us today, we have Ambassador Dennis Ross and Helit Barel. And we will first have Ambassador Ross speak, and then Helit will join us. Ambassador Ross Dennis is a counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Prior to joining the Institute in 2011, he served as the Director of Policy Planning in the State Department under George H.W. Bush, the Special Middle East Coordinator under President Bill Clinton, a Special Advisor for the Persian Gulf and Southwest Asia to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the region. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played leading roles in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process and dealing directly with parties in the negotiation. He's also the author of some terrific books, including one about the U.S.-Israel relationship, which I strongly encourage everybody here to read. We'd also like to welcome Helit Barel, former Executive Director of the Council for Peace and Security, and a former Director at the Israel National Security Council, heading the U.S.-Israel Bilateral Desk. Prior to that, she worked at the Congressional Research Service in Washington, D.C., authoring several reports for Congress on issues related to weapons of mass destruction. Helit is a founding member and former executive board member of the Devora Forum for Women in Foreign Policy and National Security, and of the Israel Nuclear Forum. Each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes to provide an overview of where we stand. And then I will follow up with 1 or 2 questions. If you have questions at any point, please use the Q&A feature, and we hope to get to as many questions as possible, so please keep them succinct. And also, closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. I guess we'll start now with Ambassador Ross. Take it from here, Dennis, and then we will turn to Helit, and then we will go to Q&A. And both of you, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Sure. Thanks, Ron. Nice to be with everybody, even if we continue to do these things virtually. Let me do a kind of encapsulation of several different points. I want to say something about Ukraine. I want to say something about the Iran nuclear deal. I want to say something about what's happening in the region more generally. And then I'll try to wrap up with a few comments also on the recent violence in Israel. Let's again kind of frame what we see happening with Russia and Ukraine. What's very clear is that Vladimir Putin drank his own Kool-Aid when it came to exaggerating his own strength, looking at Ukraine as not being a real country. And those miscalculations have produced a disastrous war from every conceivable standpoint. But I think we also have to be realistic and understand that his misreading of Ukraine represented his own mythologies. I'm not sure you can say the same thing about how he viewed the West and its likely responses. There was a pattern of very limited or non-responses from the US and from the Europeans going back more than a decade. Think about the fact that when you look at Putin's first violation of territorial norms and territorial integrity and the sovereignty of a neighbor, he invaded Georgia in the year 2008 during the George Bush 43 presidency. He hived off what were two republics, Ossetia and Abkhazia, recognized them. This was kind of a rehearsal of what we're seeing today, especially in terms of what we think is going to be his effort to try to create a kind of Western and Eastern Ukraine, divide the country in two. That invasion drew almost no response. We obviously know when it comes to Crimea. Here again, he went in, but the way he went in, it's worth keeping in mind, the way he went in, if you'll recall, with little green men. Not literally little green men, but Russian soldiers went in with no identifiable insignia. And the reason was he wanted to create deniability. He wasn't sure what the response was going to be. The response, again, was very limited. There were limited sanctions that were imposed, had minimal effect on the Russian economy. He goes into Eastern Ukraine. Initially, he says when he goes into Eastern Ukraine, he denies there's any Russian military there. And then later he acknowledges, well, there were Russian military who were there, but they were there on holiday. Because as we all know, that you go to a war zone when you're on holiday. Again, no real response. President Obama decides not to provide lethal assistance to the Ukrainians for fear that this issue matters more to the Russians than us, and if we provide that, it'll be provocative, and the Russians will escalate. We see the pattern, obviously, not just with Obama. Obviously, there is the red line, which indicates our hesitancy that Obama, sort of announces and then walks back from. But look at the Trump administration. President Trump announces twice in 2017 that he has agreements with President Putin on Syria. In the first meeting, he comes out and announces there'll be a ceasefire. Russians don't live up to it. Second meeting, he announces after the Trump-Putin meeting, he announces there is an agreement on de-escalation zones. Once again, the Russians don't live up to it. And once again, there's no cost for not living up to the promises. And obviously, we have the way we withdrew from Afghanistan signaling this kind of imagery that we are determined to retrench. Now, I make these points not to in any way justify what is an unconscionable war that Putin is carrying out, but to remind us that when there are constant tests to what have been basic international norms, like borders are supposed to be inviolate, sovereignty is supposed to be respected. When there are constant tests to those basic norms and there's no response, we shouldn't be particularly surprised when we see this kind of behavior. And I'm making this point not only to talk about Putin, and obviously we can get into later on in the Q&A what it will take to bring this to a conclusion. I make the point because it wasn't only Putin that watched what was limited or non-American and European responses. Obviously, President Xi in China, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and obviously Ali Khamenei in Iran. In Iran, we see that Iran has lost its fear of us. We see that they have no hesitancy. They have hit, even again last week, they hit a base where we're located in Syria. We had 7 Americans wounded in that. There is, by my account, more than 45 such attacks on bases in Iraq and Syria where we're located. We have responded twice, but in very limited ways. And the more you calibrate your responses to try to prevent an escalation, the more you send a signal to the other side that you're afraid of escalation. So if you want to deter, that's not the way to do it. These limited or non-responses send a message to everyone. If you want to change the reality, then you have to be prepared to employ hard power, not just soft power. What is interesting in terms of pressure on Russia and who has leverage, you'll recall at the beginning of this, after the invasion, the Russians came out and basically said, before they would support the conclusion of what might be a reconstituted Iran deal, meaning a reconstituted joint comprehensive in the JCPOA, they needed to carve out a sanctions exemption space for their trade with Iran, to which the other members of the 5+1 all said no. And the Iranians understood if that was the case, they wouldn't get sanctions relief. So you had the foreign minister of Iran go to Russia, and suddenly the Russians backed off and said, no, there won't be this kind of carve out. Now, it is interesting that the Iranians have that kind of leverage. And this is a way of getting into, will we see a renewed deal or not? I will say this, Ron, you said in your introduction that we seem to be very close. We may be, but we also have to note that the Iranians imposed a new condition for concluding, which was the delisting of the Revolutionary Guard. The Trump administration put them on the State Department's foreign terrorist organization list, and they want to be delisted. Now, some within the administration who argued for this said, look, all the other constituent parts, like the Quds Force and all the different elements of the Revolutionary Guard, are already designated by the Treasury Department for under the terrorism rules, under money laundering rules, under nuclear nonproliferation rules, and so forth. So this is just a symbolic move. But there are times when symbolism is important. At the very time that the Revolutionary Guard took credit for launching rockets into Erbil, saying that they were hitting a suspected Israeli site. Of course, they hit the TV station of the Barzani clan in northern Iraq. They also hit the villa of probably the biggest financial supporter of the Barzani clan in northern Iraq. At the very moment they did that, the idea of taking them off the foreign terrorist organization list would seem to be a kind of contradiction, because when you fire rockets at civilian areas, that's an act of terrorism. It is also ironic that it is the Iranians who say, look, this nuclear issue is one thing, everything else is separate. And yet they want the Revolutionary Guard to be taken off the foreign terrorism organization list. The rumors at this point, leaks at this point, suggest that while there are those in the administration who favor it, one rather important person seems to oppose it, and that's the president. So we'll see whether the Iranians are prepared to hang tough on this. If so, we're not going to see a deal anytime. We can expect the Iranians to ratchet up what they're doing on their nuclear program as a way of putting pressure on us, and the administration will have to decide what it's going to do. Let me take 2 minutes just to give you, if there is a deal, kind of the pros and cons, so we can then discuss this, or at least create a context for it. What's the main pro? The main pro for the deal is that the Iranians over the last couple of years, after Trump walked away from the JCPOA, by the way, without a strategy for what would be done, the Iranians have effectively not only blown through all of the limitations, over the last couple of years, they've worked through and worked out all the bugs, the technological bugs and problems they would have with advanced centrifuges. These were advanced centrifuges that were limited in terms of doing any R&D on, according to the deal, the JCPOA, and they couldn't install any until the year 2025, actually the beginning of 2026. Now, they spent the last couple of years not only installing them, testing them, furthering their R&D, but beginning actually to use, for example, IR6s. Actually, they have multiple models of advanced centrifuges. They've been using IR6s to enrich to 20%. 20% is the dividing line between low enriched uranium and highly enriched uranium. So they've worked through all these bugs, and these are dramatically more efficient machines than the first generation centrifuges. And what that tells you is that the breakout time would drop dramatically once they can begin to operate these. Now, they're operating them now. If they do the deal, they have to unplug these machines. They can't be plugged back in until starting in 2026. And even then, there can be a gradual, not a one-for-one replacement of the old machines. So the main pro is you stop that advance. They have also enriched to 60%, which is extremely close to weapons grade. So all the 60% has to be shipped out of the country. All the 20% has to be shipped out of the country. They have 10 times the amount of enriched material that they're permitted to have in the terms deal. That all has to be shipped out of the country, although admittedly it's going to be shipped to Russia. In any case, what you're doing is you're rolling back the program in one important respect. You're basically building a breakout time again. The breakout time right now is probably less than 3 weeks. You're stretching it out again if you do the deal. So that's the main pro for this deal is you're buying time. We can debate how much time you're buying, but you're buying time. If you don't have the deal, then you're facing what could be a very short breakout time. The Iranians could enrich to 90%, which is weapons grade, without the IAE in there. What you don't have the kind of monitoring you need. They could divert this material away. They can in small amounts, they can hide it all over the country. You got weapons grade material in those circumstances in places we're very unlikely to know. That's about outcome.
Dennis, can you explain to people what it means by a 3-week breakout time?
Right, that doesn't mean they have a weapon in 3 weeks.
What does that mean?
What it means is the hardest thing if you're going to have an operational nuclear weapon, meaning one you can also deliver, there's 3 things you have to have. The most important, the hardest to acquire over time is the technological ability to create weapons grade fissile material. You still have to be able to form that and shape that into a bomb. But the hardest thing to do is first to be in a position where you can create that. They will have 3 weeks, in 3 weeks they could likely have weapons grade fissile material. And as I said, they could squirrel it away and you wouldn't know where it is. That would be quite dangerous. So the main pro is what I just described. You're pushing that off. It buys you time to try to do something about that. Many in the Israeli military who I talked to when I was just out there, they didn't think this is a good deal, but they think we need to buy the time because we weren't doing some of the things we would need to do to be in a position to act militarily if it comes to that. So the political leadership, even I would say the intelligence organizations are not necessarily in favor, and I would say not necessarily, they're not in favor of the JCPOA for a reason I'll get to in a second. But many in the military, the senior military establishment that I was talking to, favored it because it buys time. Okay, what's the main con? The main con is that the Iranians will have all the sanctions lifted. Now imagine what that means at a time when they're causing as much trouble in the region as they are. They have been producing and developing and producing and basically sending to all the militias a wide array of different drones, missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. They've been doing this even when they've been under sanctions, even when the sanctions have severely damaged their economy. So you can imagine when the sanctions are lifted and suddenly they're able to sell their oil again in a legal way. They have access to frozen accounts that right now they don't have access to. Conservative guess is that there's probably $20 billion they'd immediately be able to have access to. Let's say they give 5% of that to the militias. That's $1 billion. $1 billion goes a very long ways with these kinds of militias. So the point is you weigh what you're gaining in terms of deferring the nuclear program against what is the cost of having them have all these additional resources. At a minimum, what it argues for is having a strategy to counter what the Iranians will do in the region. The one thing I can guarantee is that in the aftermath of doing the deal, if in fact it's done, if for no other reason than to demonstrate by the Supreme Leader that he has not given up his, quote, resistance ideology, they will ratchet things up in the region and they'll have the means to do it. So you need to have a strategy to counter that. I'm going to easily exceed my time. So maybe I don't know if you want me to wrap up now or just close with maybe 2 other comments and then.
Well, why don't we hold off now, let Helit go ahead and begin her presentation, and then during the questions and answers, you can add your points and summarize as well. Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Helit, thank you, Dennis. Helit, would you like to take it from here?
Sure. Well, I think I'd like to start with just generally framing the issue of the nuclear deal in something that I think is very important, which is that we are fully now within a new nuclear age. And What I mean by that is, if you look at Ukraine, one of the first steps that Putin took before or as he began his invasion was to frame this crisis with a nuclear strategy. So first, he conducts a nuclear drill several days before, maybe 3 or 4 days before the invasion begins. Then he immediately refers to the nuclear framework in his probably mostly symbolic or declaratory act of raising nuclear alert of the Russian forces, to remind everybody that this is a nuclear power that we're talking about. In other words, Russia might not be a superpower in any way, economically, politically, conventionally, certainly very inferior to the United States and NATO, but it is still a nuclear power, a significant one. And so that's one element. And I think it's very important to understand that, because it frames something that has been going on in the Middle East for a long time. We didn't need Russia and Ukraine in the Middle East to be well within this new nuclear awakening and nuclear age. But it makes a big difference when you look at how a nuclear power is treated. And if you're the head of a Middle Eastern country considering whether or not to pursue nuclear capabilities, certainly you look at that and you look at the Budapest Memorandum and everything that transpired and think to yourself, well, what is the calculus here? But again, as I said before, in the Middle East, Russia-Ukraine crisis was not needed for countries to start pursuing very seriously certain nuclear programs and nuclear capabilities, because whereas the JCPOA that was signed in 2015, and as Ambassador Ross said, was really a time-buying strategy from the very beginning, certainly in Israeli eyes. But it seemed like for the American administration at the time, it checked a box. It was in American eyes, it seemed as if, okay, we've taken care of this Iranian issue. Unfortunately, that was not a view that was subscribed to by any other Middle Eastern country that feels threatened by Iran. And I'm not necessarily talking about just Israel. I mean, there are countries in the Middle East that are far more threatened by Iranian nuclear weapons than Israel, in my mind, despite the declarations. And that's what we're seeing in Saudi and Turkey and other places. And that didn't start with Ukraine and Russia, but certainly
that may take a lot of people by surprise, because most people on this phone are members of the American Jewish community and pro-Israel activists. So when you say that there are other countries that are more threatened by, or more likely or more threatened by an Iran nuclear weapon than Israel, I think a lot of people are scratching their heads and saying, why, when every other day there seems to be a declaration out of Iran that we're going to wipe Israel off the face of the earth? Why would other Middle Eastern countries be more worried about an Iranian nuclear weapon than Israel?
The only reason that I would refer to very broadly is military capabilities that, as we all, I think, understand, Israel is a regional power that is very, very strong and has military capabilities that other countries just don't have, whether it's cyber, whether it's conventional, whether it's anything else. And the reliance of nations in the Middle East on the United States for security assurances has been very, very great. And with the United States position, at least as it is perceived by really widely in the Middle East as pivoting out of the Middle East, and the pivot to Asia has certainly increased those insecurities. And I would say more so in countries that are not as strong as Israel. Israel is really an independent source of power, luckily, and should remain so. But I think in terms of just capabilities and balance. And also, not that Iran is not very, very active in arenas very close to Israel, in Lebanon and Syria, so on. And of course, within terrorist organizations in the West Bank and in Gaza. But when you look at the reality, for example, in Saudi or at Yemen and in other places, Syria as well, you see the activity from Iran. Again, I think these are very active arenas. And so the threat is very real in all of those countries, but the capabilities are different. So you can see the responses from Israel, for example, in Syria and Lebanon that are very strong responses, as they should be. And you can't really see those in the same way from Saudi and others, because the reliance is on different capabilities. So that is the point. It's not that Iran doesn't declare malintention towards Israel every other day. But again, so basically the impetus to look for one's own independent capability to deter a nuclear nation is very, very strong currently in the Middle East, and it has been for a while, but the context of Russia, Ukraine is really, really important here. And I think before we go into the details of the agreement itself, it's very important to understand that we are now fully in this stage where not only is Iran extremely close to being a threshold state, but it could very well throw other nations into this kind of status, or at least seeking this kind of status. And if anybody, I am a researcher and have been for years of nuclear deterrence and how different balances would look in the Middle East. And if we could maybe think of a, bipolar dyad of nuclear capabilities in the Middle East and figure out, well, we've seen it in the Cold War, we've seen it in India, Pakistan, how would it work here? Thinking about a multi-nuclear Middle East is not something that I would like to do. And I think it is far, far beyond time for the United States and Europe to take action to try and prevent or roll back this trend, which is a very strong trend and very, very detrimental to everybody in the region and outside. It's not just a regional issue. It's something to consider very strongly. Now, about the deal itself, I think it's important to notice that there are several, obviously the position in Israel, the foreign position is very much as Ambassador Ross described it, but I think here's the issue again. With the JCPOA, it was a time buying strategy. I'm not sure anybody did what needed to be done with this time. This is the problem. And the other problem is that even if you can't really revive the JCPOA. You cannot do that because A, the sunset clause is too close for it to be effective in the same way. Second, as Ambassador Ross discussed, there have been so many advances. And then your breakout time would be, it won't be 3 weeks, but if the JCPOA was estimated as at a year, 18 months, at most 24 months, now we're talking about around 12 months, and that's a very, very short breakout time. Keep in mind that we're not just talking about what we know about all the Iranian, I don't really want to say violations of the JCPOA because Trump administration left the JCPOA before these violations began, so I really don't know what the status of that would be. But 60% uranium, the centrifuges, the R&D and all of that. But in addition, it's important to remember that there's an IAEA track with Iran, where Iran has an open file for violations outside of the JCPOA, including 4 sites of undeclared problematic issues. Uranium metal, which is a big deal because that's a big part of the technology you need to move to the next stage. And 3 sites where undeclared where uranium or fissile material, enriched fissile material was found. And the IAEA, luckily this time, is not required to close the file. That's still open, and Iran is supposed to have given its responses a few weeks ago. That didn't happen. I don't know exactly what the state of that is with GOC, but it's an ongoing issue. So the entire question of centrifuges that, from what we know of the deal, and these are just rumors, nothing formal has come out, are to be kept in Iran under IAEA underwriting and sealed, but still in Iran. And then the fissile material that is to be removed to Russia, with a rumor that 2.5 kilos of 60% enriched uranium are to remain in Iran. So it's all very strange in terms of time buying. Why? Because it buys very little time. And then again, even with the time that it buys, my question is, what is anybody doing with this time? And I would also like to point out, because I think I have like 3 minutes left. I'd like to point out, I'm fine, okay. The issue of contingency planning. So what happens if this deal doesn't happen? And there's a good chance it won't happen. I mean, up until a few weeks ago, I was convinced it was going to happen because there was a very strong drive. And in the context of Russia, Ukraine, with the oil being such a big factor, the United States really wanted Iranian oil back. And certainly, although it's not really mentioned, Iran has very strong incentives to get back into the market, especially now. And the finances, yes, they're a little bit better, but Iran is financially a mess. And I think we all understand that there are very strong motivations for Iran to be at the table, right? But now with the issue of the FTO becoming this political issue within the United States, Republicans and Democrats opposing it because of its symbolic value. And again, the symbolism, I agree, there's not that much practical element to it. But recently, when I have been able to discuss things with colleagues from the Gulf and colleagues from throughout the Middle East, it is unbelievable the response to the possibility of removing Iran from the Foreign Terrorist Organization, its designation, not Iran, the IRGC.
Is that what triggers the sanctions of the United States? Is that the main trigger?
No. As Ambassador Ross said before, the sanctions really come from very specific sanctions. For example, Treasury has the sanctions for the UAVs that they added in October. There are long-standing sanctions. It really is a largely symbolic move, but the importance of it is actually tremendous. More than I can say, honestly, I understood until I had conversations with colleagues in the region, where to them, the IRGC is just such a red flag and take it off the foreign. They're very happy with that action that the Trump administration took. And to them, it is almost, they focus on that more than they focus on the nuclear technical issues of this agreement. So it's a big deal. It doesn't seem like it's going to be resolved if we hear Secretary Blinken's statement from just a few days ago, where he says, it's not sure it could be a negotiation tactic from the United States, but it could also be very real. We are in coming close to an election in the United States, and it's a very hot political issue, and it matters in the region. So the issues with the agreement are very great, but even if it is signed, we buy time. What happens at the time? If it's not signed, I really think the United States and Israel need to have a contingency plan about what to do, because we are seeing Iran firmly moving to the threshold. And now the question is, again, as I mentioned, former researcher of nuclear deterrence, this is a very, very precarious time, this move from non-proliferation to starting to deal with a country that could be a nuclear rival, especially when we see now what happens with a country that's a nuclear rival. And also because we know very well from experience and history that when the nuclear level comes in, the conventional level, at least in the early stages, can become far more volatile because the country who has acquired nuclear weapons perceive this new sense of immunity and strength and so on and so forth. And I don't think that Iran is going to be any different in that sense if that happens. So we have a lot on the table.
Helit, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Great, as always, a wonderful comprehensive analysis from both of you. Thank you so much. Let me start off by asking a very simple question. The Iran deal is now signed. How does Israel's defense posture change, and what contingencies must she take? The Iran deal is not signed. How is Israel's defense posture, and what contingencies could she take? Who would like to start? Helit, would you like to start? The Iran deal is signed. What does Israel do? The Iran deal is not signed. What's the reaction from Israel?
So look, if the Iran deal is signed, it's a little bit of more of the same. It's just not enough more of the same, right? So again, it's buying time. What do you do at this time? I think Israel had a problem with what it did with the time that was bought last time. Yes, I think it's very important to continue these actions. There's a very active cyber war going on between Iran and Israel, and there are some successes, but they are not substantial enough to indicate any rollback or permanent harm to this train of Iranian nuclear program towards the threshold. And I think that's why we're hearing and seeing a lot of activity on the military front with this. When military people say, yes, we should sign this agreement to get more time, it's because they're, you know, there's a contingency. They need to be ready for something, and that's not something that happens within a month. So I do think it will shift either way, if it's signed or if it's not signed. We have seen a shift to saying, okay, it seems like Iran is rushing towards the threshold. The consequences are clear to us here in the Middle East, and something needs to be done, preferably in a joint way with the United States, once the United States understand that the Iran is going one way. But either way, something needs to be done. More time at least needs to be bought. And I think that's what we're going to see happening. Now, hopefully, again, I was a proponent of the JCPOA. I thought it had a lot of flaws, but the time buying issue was everything. But now we're running out of time for buying time. So if the deal isn't signed and you haven't bought any time and you're 3 weeks away from the threshold, as Ambassador Ross mentioned, I think it is yesterday for the United States and Israel to get much closer about the strategy of what happens next and how do you prevent Iran from going to the threshold, and hopefully that is still within reach, this preventive measure of, because my bottom line is, look, we, as I said before, firmly within a nuclear age here. Iran is too close now for us to pretend like it's not a threshold state, or couldn't be very shortly, and that this Iran going nuclear could never happen, and it definitely will be stopped. I don't know.
Dennis?
So I would say, let me build on what Helit was saying. Whether we have the deal or we don't, the one thing that is consistent with both, we have to restore our deterrent. That means a collective deterrent. It means
American or Israeli or both?
Both. Look, the Iranians don't believe that we will strike them militarily, and they think we will prevent Israel from striking them militarily. So let's say we have the deal. If we have the deal, the way you boost deterrence is by what we need to do in the region. We have to raise the cost of the Iranians of what's happening in the region, with the theory that if they understand we're going to do more to counter them meaningfully, practically in the region, and that's the low end, they can imagine what we'll do if they actually move towards a nuclear weapon on the high end. But let me be more specific. Do
you think Biden would do that, Dennis?
Oh, let me outline the kind of things you can do, which I think he can do. And that's, by the way, I think it becomes true whether we have the deal or we don't. The difference is, if we don't have the deal, you need to be doing things that signal what you're prepared to do against their nuclear infrastructure. Right. You need to, even with the deal, I think you have to do that. But let me outline some of the things that we could be doing. First, Israel is in the Central Command. We have multiple commands around the world, right? Israel's in the Central Command with the Arab states. Now, one of the things that we can be doing is immediately we can begin to run exercises. We can integrate beyond exercise, we can integrate the missile, air defense, cyber defenses, early warning, do much more in terms of a common approach to dealing with drones. All this can be done in an integrated regional way, which doesn't exist today. I can tell you from my efforts in the past to get the GCC states, these Gulf Cooperation Council states, to allow us to integrate just with them, instead of what we've been doing on a bilateral basis. We had a bilateral relationship with each of these states. We provided Patriot missiles and THAAD. These are both anti-missile capabilities. And we sold them individually, but the whole network wasn't integrated. The command control of these systems and the radar is what basically governs what happens with them. If you connect all these in the region, including with Israel, you've dramatically strengthened your capacity to blunt the things that the Iranians are doing.
Why is that?
Well, because it's like this is a case where the sum is much greater than the individual parts. You get much greater coverage if you bring them all together. Mm-hmm. Right, so that's point one. But point two, I made a reference to exercises. We should be rehearsing what would be attacks against hardened sites. The Iranians watch very closely our exercises. We should be doing it with the Israelis. We should be rehearsing what would be attacks going against hardened sites. That would send them a message. We might have a declaratory policy in which we say, if you move towards a nuclear weapon, we will take out your whole nuclear infrastructure. And then we should have exercises that sort of make it clear this is in fact what we're preparing to do. So they don't just think that these are words that are just purely rhetoric and nothing will be done. We should, you have probably heard me say this because I've been pushing for it since 2015. We should give the Israelis a massive ordnance penetrator.
Now, you wrote an article in the Post about that, and right after the deal, right?
This is a 30,000-pound bomb that has a fuse that ignites deep underground. One of the enrichment sites in Iran is Fordo, which is built into a mountain. You hear bunker busters. Bunker busters don't destroy mountains. Usually nuclear weapons can destroy mountains. We didn't want to have to use a nuclear device. So during the Obama administration, this was in fact developed. We should give it to the Israelis for two reasons. Because as I said before, the Iranians think not only that we won't strike, but we'll stop Israel from striking. The minute we give this to the Israelis, first of all, it tells the Iranians they know if we're not constraining Israel, Israel will act. And this gives them a capability they presently don't have. So number one, you're making it more likely that Israel can act against them. Number two, you're sending a signal that the US will be supportive if they do. Again, the whole point here is enhanced deterrence. What more can we do to enhance deterrence? So what I just described is one level, doing more in the region. We should be providing more material to the Saudis and the Emiratis now to deal with the threats that they're facing. The Saudis have been hit by a range. Just if you go 2 weeks ago, in the course of 1 week, they had a desalination plant hit by the Houthis. They had 2 different oil facilities hit by the Houthis. They had one that in Jeddah that basically, produced a huge fireball. They've been living with this, and because of Khashoggi, there's been this hesitancy to do a lot. We began to do a little bit more in terms of helping them defensively, but we drew this distinction between defensive and offensive weapons, which in many ways is a kind of artificial distinction. We need to take a different view in terms of bolstering their defenses. And this gets back to a point that Helit was making that was a very important point that shouldn't be glossed over. In the aftermath of Russia-Ukraine, the impulse to get nuclear weapons by a lot of other countries is going to go up, precisely because they saw, if Ukraine hadn't given up nuclear weapons, Putin could not have done this. And what Helit was saying about, countries in the region, the less they feel that the US is reliable, the more they feel they have to have this on their own. And now in the case of the Iranians, they see it as a kind of shield behind which they can engage in all sorts of aggression in the region. Because once they have it, who can threaten them? So that's why we have to convince them that they're running an enormous risk if they move in that direction, risking the entire nuclear infrastructure they've spent the last 3 decades trying to build up. The US has to become more reliable if we don't want the Middle East to become a nuclear armed region. And again, the balance of terror during the Cold War, everybody says, well, that worked. Mutual assured destruction, that worked. 2 points here. Number one, throughout the Cold War, there were 3 times when we were much closer to nuclear war than anybody realized, not only during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Number two, we had a secure second strike. The Russians had a secure second strike, meaning we could not disarm them, they couldn't disarm us. In the Middle East, the only country that has the ability to retaliate is going to be Israel. And every other country is unlikely to be in a position where it has a secure second strike, which means everyone will be on a hair trigger. You do not want countries to have nuclear weapons to be on a hair trigger. The risk that nuclear weapons will be used goes up dramatically. The last thing we want to see is that taboo somehow disappear.
So I have a question that I'd like to pose to both of you. I forgot, was it Rafsanjani Ahmadinejad who said Israel is 1 bomb wide?
Rafsanjani in the year 2000.
Right. Okay. So Israel is, you're saying no, Helit?
I'm saying it's almost an irrelevant, it's not irrelevant. It's very important in one way. It's very important because in terms of nuclear deterrence, being a 1 country bomb is actually very beneficial, because that means that you are very serious about anything flying your way.
No.
And You're not going to sit there and analyze nuclear forensics and see if and what and where. So anything close to a nuclear threat would trigger a response. And if we're speaking, of course, hypothetically, according to whatever foreign reports and whatnot about Israeli nuclear capabilities, if Israel is a 1 nuclear bomb and Iran is an 80 nuclear bomb country, then it's covered. It's covered. There's one country, according to these reports, there's one country in the region that has second strike capabilities. It's not Iran.
Right, air, land, and sea, according to foreign reports.
And so what's important, though, to understand is that this is a very perilous situation. I mean, clearly, people think of the Cold War as a very stable balance, but it took a long time to come to the point where it's stability. So the idea that 2 countries go nuclear and immediately a stable balance of deterrence appears is fictional. And we've seen that in India and Pakistan, where the Indians actually thought, oh, well, we've learned from the Cold War and we're going to go straight to a very stable balance. And that did not happen. We saw what happened after Kargil. We saw what happened with the bombings. And it was a very, very volatile relationship. And it remains something to look at. And Israel and Iran are already involved in proxy wars in the borders, and it's already a very perilous situation. So coming to the place where things could be triggered, especially if there's one country has second strike capability, as an Ambassador Ross said, one doesn't. So it's very, very volatile to a preemptive nuclear strike, or a preemptive, not necessarily nuclear strike, a preemptive strike counterforce strike. Counterforce means taking out your nuclear forces because they are not necessarily survivable, so on. So we're getting into extremely, extremely dangerous territory. And, you know, there is not, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, there were at least embassies. There's not an Israeli embassy in Iran. There's not, you know, we're talking about a situation here nobody wants to see. It would be very worthwhile not to get there. And I think, as Ambassador Ross explained, American capabilities are extremely far-reaching, conventional American capabilities. Prompt global strike capabilities that are conventional and others. So to me, it's not a question of military capability, it's a question of will. When we talk about deterrence, it is composed not only of your capability, but your willingness to actually employ these capabilities. And that's where the United States, in my mind, has been found lacking over the last few years. And certainly in 2015, when you signed this agreement, these are the things that needed to follow: a strong regional, it doesn't have to be a formal alliance, but some strong regional cooperation between like-minded states on the issue with assurances for Middle Eastern countries. What we saw happen is the exact opposite. Oh, yes, that's taken care of. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, which it might be a very wise choice, but the way it is perceived in the region is what it is. And now when we see this Russia-Ukraine crisis with its nuclear implications, or the nuclear shades of the issue, you understand how perilous this is all going to play out in the Middle East.
Well, I think for a lot of people, one of the things that I've been speaking to a lot of people about in the Jewish community is how the current Russia-Ukraine war actually gives sense to Israeli military doctrine. A lot of people saying, see, Israel is right. If Israel didn't have nuclear weapons, which served as a deterrent in according to foreign reports, whatever, but Israel didn't have nuclear weapons in 1973, she might have been overrun. And one of the reasons why the Arabs have always been afraid to launch more than conventional forays, because they know that Israel has the ultimate nuke weapon. The question that I'm going to ask you now is if clearly the America's conventional superiority, or the West conventional superiority, has been in display in the Ukrainian war. People who are not familiar with military tactics can currently see that America has the weaponry to beat Russians on the conventional battlefield in the hands of a determined enemy, and therefore should feel more reassured about U.S. conventional weaponry. Does what would it take? What does Israel need in terms of not just the bunker busters, not in terms of this 30,000-pound ordinance? Would there need to be a $10 billion arms sale to Israel to give her all the F-130s or whatever the recent plan is? What was it, the 130? Plus, would it need to be, what kind of conventional forces would Israel need? What kind of adaptations? What does Israel need so that Iran will fear Israel? We want Iran to fear Israel,
Well,
not just to understand.
Look, I think you have to understand something. Even if the value of providing what would be what I call a deterrence boost, not compensation, but a deterrence boost, is the message it sends the Iranians. Their fear of Israel is a function of whether or not they think that Israel is unconstrained and the US is going to allow it and even, in a sense, provide the means for it to act if it comes to that. If they think that we're still going to constrain Israel, then they're not afraid. They respect Israel's capabilities, but they also see somehow that we will constrain it. So the deterrence boost, what should it have that would be sending the message that I was describing before? We'll start with what I said, the massive ordnance penetrator and least B-2s. Provide the Israelis KC-46 refueling tankers, which the Israelis, in fact, have already contracted for and have asked to accelerate the delivery. And so far they've been told they can't be accelerated. That should be accelerated. Probably is another squadron of F-35s as well. We're not talking about $10 billion. We're not talking about chicken feed, but we're not talking about $10 billion. We're talking about a few very significant select items that allow Israel to take advantage of what both Helit and I have been talking about. If you're going to buy time, what are you going to do with the time that you buy? You need an unmistakable strategy that is played out practically and that also the Iranians can see. Now, some of that is in terms of what I just described. Also, you do a lot to help further bolster what Israel is already doing right now to build its missile defenses. Israel is doing a lot in the area of laser with the potential for very significant breakthroughs, but it will need more money to be able to accelerate that process as well. And the more they become that, the more that becomes far less penetrable, the more that enhances deterrence as well. Look, the Iranians have helped to build up 140,000 rockets in Lebanon with Hezbollah, partly because they saw that as a lever on Israel, partly because they saw that as that can deter Israel from striking us because they know they could be hit with 3,000 rockets a day or more. The more you send a message that there's an answer to that, the more that also affects the Iranian calculus.
You mean lasers potentially making those in a year or so from now, whatever that stage of development they're in, making those rockets almost useless because they can be shot out of the air by a laser?
I was going to say that you're trying to maximize everything you have in terms of a missile defense networking capabilities. You'd be adding to what you have now, what Israel has now, the laser capability. That again, you put it all together, suddenly you're enhancing deterrence. And that's, I think, if there's one message to take from what the two of us have said today, what has to happen is we have to boost deterrence. The Iranians we have to restore Iran's fear, which has been lost. That's the way to prevent them from crossing the threshold. By the way, the more the countries in the region see that we're doing, the more they will feel less of an impulse to have to acquire nuclear capability on their own. If Iran goes on the path it's on, Saudi Arabia has already declared they will feel they have to have it too. Turkey probably the same. Egypt probably the same. So we have an interest in preventing that for all the reasons that both Helit and I have talked about.
Does President Biden, do either of you feel President Biden has the political will to do that?
Look, I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact of what's happened with Russia. The one thing it's done more than anything else, it has completely discredited the progressive argument about what our posture in the world should be. The progressive wing has made the argument, and by the irony, it's also someone like Rand Paul on the conservative Republican side has the same view that forward U.S. military presence internationally, that's the source of conflict. We wouldn't have conflict, we wouldn't have problems if we didn't have forward military presence. We should withdraw all of our forces.
Fortress America, right? Yeah.
Well, think about what Putin has demonstrated wasn't our provocation. In fact, it was the image of American weakness that contributed to a sense, the price I pay will be minimal. Whatever they say, they won't follow through on. They'll talk sanctions for a while, but they won't sustain it. Now, of course, he thought he was going to succeed in 2 or 3 days, going to create a fact. The world would adjust to the fact, and whatever the talk about sanctions, it wouldn't be sustainable. He had $630 billion in reserves. Only he didn't realize that more than 60% of that was in Western bank accounts that he doesn't have access to. He has multiple miscalculations here. But the point was, he was reading what was more than a decade of limited or non-responses. That was my point up front. And that contributed to the legion of miscalculations that he made. It wasn't only his mythologies about Ukraine, which were completely wrong-headed. It turns out that the pattern of weak responses was something he had a reason to think would be repeated. Well, it turned out it wasn't, at least so far as the sanctions and provision of weapons to Ukraine is.
Helit, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, with regard to this administration, I'd actually like to point 2 things that I am optimistic about. The first thing is that the Israeli government is different and has a different attitude towards the administration. So to me, I've worked on Israeli-US bilateral for a while, and making sure that the Iranian nuclear program's first victim is not the Israeli-US relationship is very important. So I think that's one point of credit. And the other thing that I think we've been watching very closely is the administration's willingness to let Israel keep its freedom of action in the region conventionally, countering all sorts of Iranian actions. I think that is hugely important, that is not hostage to any negotiations. And it goes along with this strategy that Ambassador Ross laid out, where you say, okay, the nuclear is the nuclear, but you don't get to play around with all of these things. On the contrary, we are doing this. This is a very narrow and specific thing, and everything else that isn't dealt with within this deal will be dealt with other means, which are clearly available. And I think I don't look at the Western response or the American response to Putin now as a weakness. I agree. I think it's a shift. I think there's also a shift in the perception with Europeans when I hear them speak about what they need to do and how much they need to pitch in. So I think it's a little bit of an awakening, and we'll see how far reaching it is, but the understanding that the use of force is still with us. And it's not something where you counter it with rules and ideas because someone like Putin comes along or Iran comes along. I think the realization is beginning to sink. I think along with this shift in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords and the kind of tightening of Israel's relationships with others, there is a real opportunity here to create some sort of regional construct. It doesn't necessarily have to be super formal, but one that provides assurances to states in the Middle East so that they don't go seeking their own nuclear weapons. And those assurances can only be provided by the United States or Europe or both. It's not within region. That's how it's got to work. And I think that's a very important thing. It's a huge task. When nuclear weapons came into the world in the 1960s, President Kennedy expected there would be 30 nuclear weapon states within 20 years. That didn't happen, but it didn't happen because there was a construct put in place with Atoms for Peace and the NPT and so on and so forth that kept it from happening. And that needs to happen again in the Middle East because we're squarely there. The NPT has failed miserably within the Middle East. And this is the time, this is the opportunity to really start working on it. I don't see American will. I haven't seen American will for a long time to take that on. I think there's fatigue from the Middle East and whatever, but stamina is a big important thing in international security, and it can't be expected from the United States of America with all of the capabilities.
I got 2 quick questions, and then if you guys want to sum up, or that would be great. Quick question. Has the fact that the public optics during this negotiation when it was between Obama and Bibi, obviously there's not as much, what would you call public outcry. There seems to be a much more closer coordinated effort between the United States and the Biden administration and Bennett. Do you think this is going to pay dividends for Israel? How have the dynamics, what took place before versus the dynamics that are taking place now, are going to help Israel as she works with the United States in the future? Do you think Israel has benefited from doing this in a lower key way versus in a more public optical way? First question.
The short answer is yes. I'll give you a quick response. Yes. First, there's been complete transparency this time, when there was in fact not complete transparency last time. And secondly, I can tell you, I already know that the administration was asking if the deal is concluded. The administration is the one that raised what additional things should we be talking about providing you, which obviously wasn't quite the same last time. The irony is that if Bibi hadn't done what he did, there would have been an openness on Obama's part to do more. But by giving the speech to the Congress, it created a very sour relationship. Biden is very different in terms of his attitude. Everyone in this administration knows he does not want to have public friction with Israel because his fundamental attachment to Israel is quite strong and is even emotionally rooted.
Helit.
Yes, and I have to agree with that from an Israeli perspective as well. I think it was clearly understood within the system, even when Netanyahu was prime minister, that the friction with the United States administration, no matter who the president is, taking that road. First of all, if we find ourselves today with that strategy and we ask what were the fruits of it, well, it was rather futile. And so there's a clear understanding that there's a different road to be taken. To me, it's always been about being pragmatic and understanding the most important thing is to keep Israel in the room, keep us in the room. And that is what didn't happen last time. And I'm very hopeful that it will happen this time, especially when we're talking about a scenario where there is no deal, which is very possible. I mean, I can't wager which way it will go. And what happens next in contingency planning, it has to be joint. That wasn't an option with the former government, but I think it is very much so this time around. I am hopeful.
Okay, let me just combine two last questions. And why should the United States even trust Iran when we're not even negotiating them directly in the same room? And since they're a rogue state anyway, how can we trust anything that they're going to say that they're not going to develop a nuclear weapon in secret and get away with it?
Look, you can like the JCPOA or not like the JCPOA. The reality is the IAEA was in there monitoring 24/7.
Do you trust them to do it?
Well, the IAEA was in a position where there was a kind of transparency. They identified, look, Helit made a reference to it. They also raised other issues. There were 3 sites where traces of uranium were found. Okay, and the IAEA is insisting on a response from the Iranians. It's not a case of anybody trusts the Iranians or should trust the Iranians. It's a case the structure, the main argument for the JCPOA, even when it was done, was not that it ended the Iranian pursuit of a nuclear option. It basically deferred it. But the main argument the administration made was the transparency and verification built into this was better than previous arms control agreements. And to that, they had a point. Now, the problem is that access has been largely lost precisely because we walked away. You can, as I said, you can like the JCPOA or not like it, but when you walk away without a strategy for what replaces it, you end up where we are today. So the issue at this point becomes one of, if there is a deal, you're not trusting the Iranians. You're basically in a position where you can see what they're doing. Now, if there is no deal, you can't see what they're doing. And the problem is they're extremely close, as I said before, to being able to have a breakout capability. You make a choice. My view is if you could get this deal with all of its failings, it makes sense, but it really only makes sense if you have a deterrence strategy that accompanies it. If you don't have a deterrence strategy that accompanies it, then you better have a deterrence strategy if there is no deal. Right now, I'm not sure we have a deterrence strategy, whether there is a deal or we don't, but I'm saying we need it. Number one, I'll just conclude because you asked if we could conclude. What we know today is hard power matters. And I think a lesson the administration needs to learn, and my suspicion is it will learn it, is that hard power matters and we have to be prepared to apply it in the Middle East. We will need to boost our deterrence capability and that of Israel if in fact we want to shape things for a better future in the Middle East at a time when we actually see the very coalition that Helit is talking about taking shape. I mean, the meeting in the Negev would have been unthinkable in the past, even with the states that had made peace with Israel. It would have been unthinkable. And it sends a signal. Israel is seen by most of the Sunni Arab states as not just a natural partner, but a part of the region that they increasingly depend on, especially at a time when they're less confident about how dependable we are.
Helit?
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't want to waste too much time talking about what was with the JCPOA, but the point is, you know, I never thought it was as a principle, a bad idea to walk away from the JCPOA at some point after you've used the time that you've bought, after you got what you needed out of it, year 7, year 8, year 9, not, you know, year 3 when nothing happened, and replace it with nothing. So, but I don't want to dwell on that too much because we are where we are. We're very, very close. So, I mean, I just, you know, it sounds very repetitive, but there's no scenario in which just checking the box again, signing that deal, doesn't matter with the foreign terrorist designation or without it, signing that deal and walking away and saying that we've taken care of Iran is a real option. You are headed to mess in the Middle East if you do that, far greater than you've seen before. And I don't think it is at all wise for the United States to think the Middle East will somehow take care of itself. I'll just leave you with the words, if you want to pivot out of the Middle East, leave it at a state where you can pivot out of it. That is, create the right alliances, the right constructs, put what it takes into it, put things in shape, and then, you know, pivot away or whatever. I mean, as an Israeli, I'm not really a big believer in this idea that you can, that the United States really is just planning disappearing from this. I don't think that's the case. But the last thing, just to answer your question for then, is I'm Israeli. I don't trust anyone. Negotiations in these kind of settings are not about trust. They're about exactly the opposite. What do we do under conditions of extreme mistrust? That was the idea of this agreement, and the ability to get into Iran and to inspect far more than we could before was very important. Now, obviously, we saw from the archives that were extracted, and we saw from the IAEA files that it didn't cover everything because they're undeclared sites and there are places where the weapons group is probably working, so on and so forth. But is it a much improved state to not having any eyes on the ground? Yes. And do I trust the IAEA? Yes. Since Mohammed el-Baradei left the IAEA, I trust the IAEA. I think it made a huge difference, and that organization now is doing exactly what it is supposed to and standing its ground.
Helit, Dennis, thank you very much. It was really, both of you gave extraordinary, informative, insightful, comprehensive discussions. I'd like to know if, you know, once we declare that a deal has been signed, or once we declare that we're no longer pursuing a deal, I'd like to have you both back with us to look back at what happened and where we go from here. So consider that an open invitation in front of hundreds of people to join us for a second call. This is really fantastic. And to all our viewers and listeners who are here with us today, stay safe, and we're wishing you a Chag Sameach.